There are a few things, few sounds and cries in life more pitiful than hearing a child say, "It's broken." Children's toys, it just feels like they're made to break. Maybe they are. I don't know. I mean, that's the thing, I guess. Maybe they're made to break. Some are like made to come apart, but then be put back together. But in the world of plastics, just so many childhood tears have been shed at the snapping of small fabricated pieces that were not meant to snap. And, it's just a huge meltdown thing that happens with kids, and the pain and the loss and the disappointment, and as if it couldn't have been made any worse, there is a certain kind of situation when a child is mourning a broken thing where actually the pain can be increased and where it can be made worse. And that's when the cry isn't just, "It's broken," it's, "You broke it." Sometimes that cry is on the lips of a child. "You broke it." I had a "you broke it" story from when I was a child. I remember very clearly, young, I don't know, I was probably 5 or 6, and my parents had bought me a Stretch Armstrong. Yeah, Stretch Armstrong. Big, muscly guy in red, whatever those are, tights, underwear, and you can just stretch him, pull on his arms, stretch. We had a number of kids that would be around our house. I don't know what happened. They were just super intense. And when they would come over, my mom would actually be like, "Adam, you can hide some of your most valuable toys." Because I was just like, I've been here before. Well, one morning, it was piano lesson, some kids are over, didn't hide the Stretch Armstrong, and these girls, these sisters, they're playing with my Stretch Armstrong, and they're just like, it's like these guys' arms have like doubled all the way around the hallways of the house. They're like testing the limits, and sure enough, whatever oobleck monstrosity was holding this guy together gave out, and he snapped. And I never got another one. I don't know what happened. I didn't get a replacement one. I was just like, but I remember the moment of being like, I just got this toy. I just got this thing, and like, it's mine. You shouldn't even be playing with it. Like, I just got it. I've barely gotten to play with it. It's broken immediately. It's not even yours. And yet they're like, "Wee, bloop, bloop, bloop," and off they go. Just out of like, their life has not been marked. They're not talking about this 30 years later. I'm talking about it 30 years later. Was a blip on the radar for them. Was a cataclysmic Richter scale monitoring event for me. So, like, these things break. And, all the pain and things that come up with all of that, it's related to the amount of care that we have in relationship to the thing, right? We think about like toys breaking and plastic things breaking and Stretch Armstrong not being able to stretch anymore, and we're like, oh, those things aren't that big of a deal. But of course, they're a big deal to a child because the child knows how to care. That's actually an interesting way to put it, right? It's not just the child cares for that thing. It's a child in a weird way knows. They still know how to care for like a small, important, valuable object like that. They know how to care. And so their care matches the thing, and it breaks. Of course, we have things like this in our own lives. The child is upset when a toy breaks, but what happens to us when something valuable in our life breaks? It's actually not that we have grown in any particular way in terms of not caring about when something breaks in our lives. It's just our perception of what's valuable has changed, and when something breaks in our life, we are still crying, often physiologically crying. It's broken. What happens to you when something in your life breaks? When something snaps and you go, gosh, that wasn't supposed to snap like that. When something can't stretch anymore, and so it just gives out. What happens to you when you look at your life or something in your life and you go, it's broken? What happens to you when someone walked into your life and ruined something, and you want to look at them and go, you broke it? This is my life, and you broke it. What happens when a relationship breaks, or a pursuit, or a project breaks, or me, my mind, my emotions, my heart breaks? What's that like for us in our lives? And one of the things that we often look at and ask when a toy breaks is, can anybody fix it? Can anybody put it back together? Often, even now I have that picture in my mind of one of my nephews coming to me with two halves of a thing in their hands going, it's broken. And implicitly, they're just hoping that someone will go, I can put that thing back together again. What happens when something breaks in your life? Can it be put back together? Where do you go to put back together the broken fragments of something that is shattered in your life? It so often seems that when our life breaks or when something breaks in our lives, there's nowhere to go to get it put back together. But the Bible says that God can fix broken things. The Bible says that God can put broken pieces of our life back together. The Bible says that there's actually nothing that's too broken for God. And the Bible says that whatever has gone wrong, God can fix it. We're in the sermon series on the book of Romans, where we're learning that there's more to life than following the rules. Our text today is going to be Romans chapter 3, verses 5 through 8. We're in sort of an introductory couple of weeks where Paul is leading us through a few big picture ideas about the rules and about the law before we get in the end of chapter 3 to some of actually the main thrust of his argument. So we've been learning a couple big picture things in the past few weeks about things that are negative about the rules, even though the rules are supposed to be this good and valuable thing. We've been learning some things that are negative about them, and then last week and this week we're learning a couple things that are just generally positive about them. The past few weeks we learned that the rules can't make things fair, even though they're supposed to. The rules can't make things fair. The rules create hypocrites, and the rules create opportunities for us to fake it, for us to have external things going on in our lives that don't match our internal self. Last week, however, we learned, because after those first 3 weeks, some of you are like, okay, the rules are just all bad, I guess. And some of you are like, yeah, I always knew it. I always knew that the rules were all bad. Some of you are like, I feel like at church, at some point, someone's supposed to tell me that the rules are good. Well, last week was that week. Last week, we learned that the rules are good, full stop, on their own, and we should want to receive them because they let us know that someone believes in us. They let us know that, we still have a place to grow and have a place to go. We want to be people who receive the rules because we don't give rules anymore to people that we've given up on. So we should want to receive the rules because it means that there's more to be had in my life and my own growth. And this week we're going to look at the idea that the rules are also good, full stop, because the rules are the things by which we see that something has become broken and how it could be fixed. We cannot see that something is broken. We cannot see how something could be fixed without the light of the rules to see by. Again, we're going to be in Romans chapter 3, verses 5 to 8. I've titled today's sermon, God Can Fix It. I will read today's text aloud. But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is he? I'm speaking from a human viewpoint. Far from it. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? But if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I also still being judged as a sinner? And why not say, just as we are slanderously reported, and as some claim that we say, let's do evil that good may come of it? Their condemnation is deserved. Our lives are full of broken pieces, and the idea of breaking something or brokenness is implicitly present in our text today through the concept of unrighteousness. Paul says right at the beginning of this text here, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God. So by the time Paul's gotten to Romans chapter 3, verse 5, we're now just assuming our unrighteousness. He's talked about it, he's argued for it a little bit in Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2, early in chapter 3, but now we're just like, okay, we've done the work, we're assuming it, we're unrighteous. If you disagree with that, you can go back and read Romans 1, 2, and earlier in chapter 3, or go back and listen to the past few sermons. But today we're assuming it, we are unrighteous. And the concept of righteousness in this context is related to the concept of the law. And of course, what do you do in relationship to a law? In order to be in right relationship to the law, you get the rules right. You follow the law. And in God's law, the law that he gave, the Mosaic law to the children of Israel, there were over 600 commands that made up that law. And being righteous meant keeping those commands. It meant getting those rules right. And of course, when you don't keep a command, when you get a rule wrong, we say you've what? You've broken the law. You've snapped it. You've broken it. So implicit in the idea of righteousness, of getting rules right, is the idea that there's a wholeness to the law that I'm going to get right. And when I get even one thing wrong, what have I done? I've broken something. So implicit in the idea of righteousness is the idea of wholeness and completion. And on the other side, unrighteousness, which means error and this snapping, this transgressing, this breaking of the rules and of the law. This point is made more explicit in a different book in the New Testament. In James chapter 2, verse 10, there, James, the brother of Jesus, the early apostle, writes this, "For whoever keeps the whole law yet stumbles in one point has become guilty of all." The idea that law keeping and having essentially a relationship of rule keeping is about getting all of the rules right. You have to get them all right in order to be righteous in relationship to that law code. If you get even one thing wrong, you're guilty of the whole thing because one transgression snaps your ability to be righteous in relationship to the whole thing. One transgression breaks the law. And our unrighteousness, which is taken for granted in this passage, speaks to this essential inability that we have to keep things whole, to keep things in one piece, so to say. It speaks to our inability to get the whole of the rules right. And on the contrary side, in opposition to that, this essential thing we have going on in our nature where we are very, very good at breaking the law. We're very, very good at transgressing the rules. And as a result, there's a reflection here just of our own lives that like it sort of runs both ways. The fact that I break the law means that I'm going to have a fractured nature because I'm not able to keep the rules whole, but it also runs the other way, where maybe I break the law because there's something going wrong in my nature. There's like a mutually reciprocal thing, my actions and my nature. They're both fractured, fragmented, shattered, splintered, whatever language or image or metaphor that you want to use. There's something that's broken in our nature, and it leads me to break things in my actions. And so we live broken lives and have broken selves. We have brokenness in our events and in our relationships. Our life can just narratively understood, a collection of episodes of breaking things, just sort of moving from one thing to another, failed relationships, broken relationship to a talent or a passion. I mean, think about that. We think about like relationships that break, and of course those are terrible and painful and tragic. Think about like what happens when like you have something broken in relationship to yourself, such that something you loved or were passionate about before is now like a place of pain. That's like a unique and profound and tragic kind of brokenness that can come up in us that just speaks to the fact that I'm good at breaking things. Like it's just something that I know how to do for some reason. It's built in me. What about the brokenness of our best laid plans and dreams? You know, when I was X age, I was going to be here in 5 years and here in 10 and there in 20. And why am I just so good at making those things not come to pass? There's just something in me that's good at it. And this isn't just about a broken nature and broken actions. It can lead us to have a self that's fragile and fractured and fragmented and is almost looking for opportunities to crack and break. There's a classic parable about this that you all know about our friend Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. Here's one terrifying portrayal of Humpty Dumpty from the early 20th century from a children's book. It's never stated, to my knowledge, that Humpty Dumpty is an egg in any of the poems, but he's classically portrayed across many different iterations of the Humpty Dumpty portrayals as an egg, having an egg body or an egg head. There's something about the falling and the breaking where everyone was like, this guy's an egg. And there are different, like, who's Humpty Dumpty? I don't know, is he the king? Is he the whatever? But like Humpty Dumpty kind of like for today's purposes, and I think in a deeper parabolic way, is like you and me, right? Because we have a fragile self. We're just like, we're breakable. It doesn't say like Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, but fortunately it was made out of rubber and he bounced back up. I mean, there are other things, other constitutions of beings that don't have to be afraid of falling. But Humpty Dumpty is fragile. He's an egg. He's prone to breaking and cracking and splintering, and you and I are like that. And so whatever wall we're up on, we kind of need to be propped up there and held up there and boundaried up there because we're just like one strong gust of wind away from falling and falling a fall that we won't get back up from. You and I are like a fragile eggshell self so often, just like almost looking for opportunities to show that we're crackable. Maybe you feel this way in your life. Maybe you feel like you've had some splintering, cracking, fracturing thing in your nature. Maybe you feel like you went through some experience. Maybe you just feel like life is like that. You're just one breaking fall after the next, and you don't know how to get back up. You don't know how to be put back together. You don't know if you can get put back together. And so often we're just sort of sitting there at the bottom of a fall going, well, there's all the pieces of a life that once had some promise. There's all the little shelled remains of a life that was once going somewhere. There's all the pieces of something that was once whole, and we just sort of get used to looking around at that, I guess. I don't know. Because what else are we going to do? Because nobody knows how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Nobody knows how to put you or me back together again. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Exactly. She gets it. Nobody knows how to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. You and me, who can put us back together again? I bet she knows somehow, deep in her nature already, that God knows how to put you and I back together again. The Bible says that God knows how to put broken pieces back together. And no matter how big the shattering of your life or something in your life has been, there could just never be too many pieces scattered around such that God would show up and go, this is beyond my capability to put back together. Doesn't matter how big the shattering has been, God is able to fix broken things, no matter how broken they are. God's able to fix broken things. That's great news for you, by the way, and great news for me that God's able to fix broken things. I want to ask today, how does God do it? How does He do it? God, how do you do it? How do you put something that's broken back together? And this is like a big question. We can have many, many answers. I want to zero in on one part of this answer that helps us to think about what makes God able to put a broken thing back together. Let's go back to our text today, Romans chapter 3, verses 5 to 6. The text says this, "But if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, what shall we say? The God who inflicts wrath is not unrighteous, is He?" I'm speaking from a human viewpoint. Far from it. For otherwise, how will God judge the world? I don't know what translation I have up there, but it is not the ESV. As I'm reading, I'm like, what is going on? I've never heard that rendering. If anyone happens to have that translation open, I'd love to know what it is. Put the wrong translation up there. But if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, what shall we say? That God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us. I speak in a human way. Yeah, either way, this mystery translation is getting the job done. Look, is it really? How do I keep pulling from that? Demonstrating the superiority. Not everything that's new is best. Not everything that's new is best. We have very interactive babies today. It's wonderful. Yeah. We're all children of God, Alex. We're all babies in the eyes of our Heavenly Father. I need to give you a little context here. You remember that context sermon I did a couple weeks ago that was super long? I didn't even give you all the context that's relevant. Some of it I'm going to scatter in as we go. I know it's hard to believe that, but there's a thing that you need to know about the way that Romans is written, that if you don't know this, it's just very difficult to follow. Paul is using a certain kind of rhetorical and philosophical way of reasoning that was well known in the ancient world called diatribe. It is a form of ancient rhetorical and philosophical discourse that is about commending one's point by anticipating and bringing in other points of view into your discourse. So, for example, you might say, hey, blue is the best color. I know what you're thinking. Maybe green's the best color. No, blue is, and this is why. And the part where I just went, I know what you're thinking, is the part that you would do in ancient diatribe. You would bring in other points of view into your conversation. And so when we're reading Romans, we need to recognize that Paul is using this diatribe style to anticipate the objections of his opponents to his view, and also to bring in more justifications for the ideas that he's bringing in. So just as an example, you don't need to understand the context of the discourse that I'm about to show you, but I'm going to show you some lines from an ancient Stoic philosopher, Epictetus, who wrote just a couple decades after Paul. And I just want you to listen for the sound of what he's saying, because you're going to recognize Paul's tone in Romans from the same thing. So here's just a couple lines from Epictetus. Epictetus, two different lines that I'm giving you next to each other. He says, so what am I saying then? that man is an animal who ought to remain inactive? Heaven forbid. Now, you don't need to know what he's talking about with the man as an animal thing, but the heaven forbid thing, would you believe it if those were the exact same words that Paul uses, me genoito, to say by no means over and over again in Romans? Right? Do you hear that same thing? Do you think I'm saying this? Sure I'm not. We hear that in our text today. And we're going to hear it over and over again in Romans, this kind of thinking. Here's another passage. But why is it, someone says, right? Anticipating the interlocutor who's talking to him, that I don't know what is right or wrong. Is it that I have no preconception in this regard? No, you do have one. Is it that I fail to apply it in particular cases? No, you do apply it. So I don't apply it properly? The whole question turns on that. Do you hear what he's doing? Here is the contrary viewpoint. I'm objecting right away. This whole thing is called diatribe. It's an ancient form of discourse. Paul is doing it in Romans really over and over again. And if you don't recognize that he's doing that, you're going to be confused. Does Paul think this? He didn't think it back there. Who's speaking here? Who's whatever? You've got to think, as we're reading Romans, where Paul is pulling out the viewpoints of his objectors so that he can argue against them. And we see this happening in our text today. Paul, in Romans chapter 3, 5, and 6, is pulling out the idea, the objection that somebody might have that God isn't right to be angry with me, because my unrighteousness is an opportunity for God to be shown righteous. That's what's happening in verse 5. That's why he says, but if our unrighteousness serves to show the righteousness of God, shall we say that God is unrighteous to inflict wrath on us? Verse 6, by no means, heaven forbid. It's the exact same style. There are people who were criticizing what Paul was saying over the course of Paul's many years of pulling out these arguments. And one of the things that they were objecting towards is the idea that if my sin has become an opportunity for God to be shown righteous or faithful, so in a weird sort of way, God's maybe benefiting from my sin, God's looking good in relationship to my sin, then people would say, well, it sounds wrong for God to be mad at me when I'm sinning because he's benefiting from my sin, right? Do you see how someone could argue that? Paul could see that, and so he feels the need to address it. And Paul addresses it in verse 6 by saying this, for then how could God judge the world? For how could God judge the world? We're going to zoom in on this for a second. This is Paul's answer to this question. Is God wrong to be mad at me if my sin is an opportunity for God to look good? Paul says, not at all, for if this whole process didn't play out, how would God be able to judge the world? Let's get clear about why this is an answer to this objection. We often think that God's judgment works like this. We get something wrong, God judges it, and maybe fixes it. But there's actually an intermediate stage in between the we get something wrong and God judges it that helps to explain why God's able to do the judging part in the first place. This is how God's judgment actually works. We get something wrong, we break something. God is upset about that. God's upset that the thing was broken. God's upset about it because he knows it shouldn't have been broken. He knows what wholeness would look like, and so he's upset that it was broken. As a result of that intermediate stage where God looks at something and knows what wholeness looks like and is upset that that wholeness was ruined by brokenness, then he makes a judgment on that basis, and then looking forward, he's able to know how something could be fixed. The conclusion here is this. God's being angry when sin happens or when brokenness happens shows that God is able to judge at all. That's why Paul says in verse 6, for no means, by then how could God judge the world? People are going, why would God be mad about broken things if he's able to show himself faithful when something gets broken? And Paul goes, if God weren't upset when things were broken, God would not be able to judge anything. The fact that God is upset when something breaks shows that he knows what it should have been like, and it shows that he cares that it shouldn't have become broken. And those two things are needed for anyone to make a judgment about anything. They're needed for anyone to come to fix anything. When something is broken that shouldn't have been broken, if we're not upset by that, it just shows that we either A, don't care that it broke, or it shows B, that we never had a picture of what wholeness for this thing looked like in the first place. We literally, like the fact that it's broken is literally invisible to us. You see what I'm saying? That's what Paul is saying here about God and why it is good and right that God would be upset when things are broken, even if he's going to be able to fix it. The whole process needs to be present in order for God to be able to be the fixer of broken things that we want him to be. We have this thought in our minds today that we want a God that's not mad about anything ever, that doesn't judge anything ever. We only think this when we're thinking about things external to me. As soon as it's something about me that's been wrong, something about my life that's been broken, something that I wish had gone differently, all of a sudden we're like, I really care that God is upset about that thing because God needs to make it right and compensate me and also fix this thing. Right? Like this weird desire that we have that's born from these other places and other ideological currents that says we just want a God that's not mad about anything. You realize a God that's never mad about anything is a God that doesn't care about anything. A God that's not mad about anything is a God that literally cannot see when something is broke. It's all just pieces, parts to that God. It doesn't matter how they come together or don't come together. Now, let me be clear. The Bible is clear that God is not angry in his character. There's a difference between experiencing anger and being mad, like in my nature. The Old Testament, the place where we feel like we go to find the angry God, the Old Testament is the place that affirms over and over again that God is what? Gracious and merciful, slow to anger. Slow to anger. Being angry is not in God's character. Some people just walk around and they're mad. They're just mad in their person. Those people need to receive grace and mercy and mellowing and thawing. God is not like that, but that doesn't mean that God doesn't experience anger. That God at times doesn't watch something get broken and go, I'm mad about that. And it's good that God is mad about it because it means that he cares and he can see that it got broke. It's right for God to be upset, even upset towards us when something is broken, because it means that God has actually seen that something has gone wrong and that he knows how to fix it. And this leads us to our second good news thing today about the rules. The rules make us able to see what has gone wrong and how it can be fixed. We cannot see that something has gone wrong or that it could be fixed or should be fixed without the light and insight of the rules. We are inconsistent about the rules in the same exact way we're inconsistent about God judging me. We think that everyone's wrong to be angry about the rules. We want to avoid the rules and get off me and don't tell me things anymore. And yet we also want things in our life and in the world to be fixed and be better. Those two things do not match. They are going in opposite directions. They are mutually exclusive. We either can say, get off me, get the rules out of here, I don't care about any of them at all, and I do not care what happens in my life or in the world. Or we can say, don't be a judgmental jerk, but mediate the rules to me in the right way and the right time, because I do care how things go in my life and how things go in the world. So I need rules, so bring them on. Either one of those two things are options for the person who wants to have integrity. For the person who doesn't mind being split and running in two different directions at the same time, then we can still say, I hate the rules, get off me, and the world should be a better place. Because otherwise they do not fit. Without rules and being upset, we cannot see how something should be fixed or that it is broken at all in the first place. I mean, really, just think about it. For example, what is the difference between a bunch of ceramic pieces on the ground and a broken plate? What's the difference between those two things? Well, rules and feelings are the difference between those two things. Rules and feelings that tell me those pieces were supposed to come together as a plate, and I'm upset that they're not doing that anymore. That's the difference between broken ceramic piece. I did it. Broken, value judgment. Between raw ceramic pieces on the ground and a broken plate. In your life, what is the difference between people just not together anymore and a breakup? What is the difference between not working anymore and losing a job? What is the difference between observing biological decay and watching someone prepare to die? Rules and feelings are what's different. Rules that show me how something was supposed to be, and feelings that tell me it really should have been that way. We should agree with this and acknowledge this, because we all should look at our lives in the world and go, there's just full overflowing of examples of us wanting to look and say, it shouldn't have been like that. This is how that thing was supposed to go, and we want it to go that different and better way. The problem is that we ourself sort of wants to think that way about everything except for me. We want to look at like any other areas of life. Yeah, this is what that was supposed to be like, and I feel really strongly that it should be that way. We want to have that knowledge and that moral feeling and courage about basically everything other than me. And the problem to bring, the inability to bring myself, my whole self to the table in that equation makes me unable to actually be true in all this other stuff that I would say I want to have clear thoughts and feelings about. In our desire to avoid this judgment ourselves, we even, as some of Paul's opponents have done here, create new sort of twisted ways of thinking about this, such that we can just kind of get out from under the ability for the opportunity for me to be judged at all in the first place. Paul anticipates two other objections that people have. He treats them with way less respect than he does with the first one. The first one he answers. These next two he doesn't. He answers one of them later, but in this moment he just says they're bad ideas. So let's look at Romans 3, 7-8. He says, "But if through my lie the truth of God abounded to his glory, why am I still being judged as a sinner? And why not say, just as we are slanderously reported and as some claim that we say, let's do evil that good may come of it. Their condemnation is deserved." Paul's saying that there are people, again, who are, he's anticipating their arguments, who are saying, instead of saying in order for broken things to be fixed, we need judgments, even when those things fall on me. That's what we want to say. That's what we should say. We say instead, if God's judgments work out for his benefit, it's not fair that I'm ever called to account for what I did. Or we say, if God is benefiting from opportunities to be righteous in judgment, maybe that's a chance for me to do more bad things, because God is proven right more and more and more every time he gets to judge a bad thing I do. So here's an opportunity for me to just really go wild with all the bad stuff I want to do. It's interesting when Paul says here, just as we are slanderously reported, and as some claim we say, that last charge in verse 8, why not do evil that good may come, as our non-mystery translation says, the ESV says, multiple people have charged Paul with teaching that over and over again, actually, like around the ancient world. So it's like important to recognize that actually, like, there's a couple things to learn from this. One of the things we learn from it is that what he's going to teach ultimately about grace and faith is so radical that people are often charging Paul with being someone who doesn't care about the rules. And Paul is like, no, I care about the rules. I just want to think about them now in light of the grace and faith that's been offered with Jesus. But people keep charging Paul this thing, he's getting tired of it, so he references it here. Paul says of these two things, he just says their condemnation is deserved. In other words, again, the second one he's going to come back to later in Romans 6, we'll come back to that, but he just looks at these and says, these are obviously ways of thinking that we're just reaching for to get out from under God's judgment of myself. These ways of thinking just deserve to be condemned. They're not thoughts we're actually thinking that's like, this is my actual account of how God works or how the world works. Paul's like, these ways of thinking just need to be condemned. What we should say instead is that God's judgment is so good in every situation that broken things should be fixed, and so God should tell us how to fix them, that we should want to hear God speak those judgments out in every area of reality, including me. That's what we should say, but we don't. Our posture should be any judgments from God that are necessary to be spoken so that things can be fixed should be spoken, even if those judgments are being spoken over me. We should ourselves care so much about the fixing of broken things that God should do anything, even if it means dealing harshly with me to fix them. Let me get clear about that. That's what it would look like to care about the fixing of broken things. If we really care about God putting everything to right, we would say, God, I care so much about the fixing of everything that's broken that you can deal with me first if you need to in order to fix it. And the fact that we don't do that leads us to all these other thought patterns. The difficulty with this is that, maybe God will deal harshly with you and me. Maybe at the end of the day, if we were to get a full and transparent picture of our lives and our spheres of influence and everything that's gone right and everything that's gone wrong, there's actually a good amount of brokenness to clean up that's just present in me and that I've caused out there. And so maybe in order for God to fix things and put things back together and put everything right, God does have to deal harshly with you and me. Maybe God would look at the whole thing and go, actually, in order to stop the brokenness, I have to break the people who are doing the breaking. Maybe that would actually have to happen. And in times past, the answer to that question seemed to be yes. That even when we come to God in faith, and even when we want to get things right, and even when we say, God, I care more about your judgments than my own self-preservation, that there was something built into the equation where God said, I do have to fundamentally break you in some way so that you will stop breaking stuff. But in these blessed days, God has provided a way through His Son, Jesus Christ, that you and I might be fixed and put back together. Instead of us needing to be broken, Jesus Christ allowed His own body to be broken and shattered so that yours doesn't have to be. Jesus broke His own body so that you don't have to break yours. 1 Corinthians 11:24 says this, when Jesus had given thanks, He broke bread and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Jesus was broken to fix a broken world. Our world is full of things that are broken and that were not meant to be broken. Things that shouldn't have been broken. Things that are broken in cheap and callous and unthinking ways. And God looks at all of that and He's upset about it. And He should be. He should be upset about it. If He weren't upset about it, He wouldn't be able to see that things are broken and He wouldn't care about fixing it. And you and I are often the culprits of why things are broken. We're one of the chief people knocking stuff off the cupboards and the cabinets and throwing things onto the ground and playing sports with fragile objects and just breaking things over and over and over again. And so at some point, the people who are breaking things need to be stopped somehow. They need to be broken so that they will stop breaking other things. We're just putting our nature off onto other people over and over again. And Jesus of Nazareth, God's Son, showed up and He allowed His body to be broken in the stead of you and me. It's as though we entered a room full, just littered of shattered and broken things. And in the moments of our receiving our just judgment for that, Jesus showed up and said, I broke those things. Break me. If you and I had to undergo the brokenness that Jesus went through, there would be no repair for you and me. No one could have ever put us back together again. But when Jesus died on the cross and went through the brokenness that He endured, because He was truly righteous, it wasn't right for Him to have ever been broken in the first place. Jesus is the one person in relationship to the rules who never broke anything. Jesus never broke anything. And so it didn't fit that he endured a brokenness that you and I were meant for. The brokenness that he endured would have been right for unrighteous, broken people, but for righteous and unbroken people, it was not right for him to be broken. And so God raised Jesus up from the dead. He took the brokenness that Jesus endured and matched it onto his unbroken righteousness and put it back together again, put his body back together again. For we are the ones sitting up on a wall. And we fracture and shatter and crack when we fall. But because God would fix broken children of men, he put Jesus Christ back together again. And if God put Jesus Christ back together, he can put you back together. He can put you back together. He can put your life back together. He can put that fractured thing back together. He can put that broken dream back together. There is nothing that God cannot put back together again because he has put the body of Jesus Christ back together. You should believe that God can put you back together. You should believe that God can put your life back together. The world and its gathered evidence generally says things cannot be put back together. But you should today believe in spite of that fleshly evidence and know that God through faith can put anything back together. You should grab on to faith in that today and believe whatever that broken thing is that exists in your mind now, your life, your direction, that relationship, that dream, you should believe now and grab onto faith as God gives you ability to and say, God, I believe that you can put that thing back together. I know that you can through faith because God can. He put Jesus back together. He can put you back together as well. You've got to do something though in order to be put back together. You have to let something in. And it's the rules. You've got to let the rules in. The idea that you want to be fixed, that your life should be put back together in some way, that there's something that you've gone through that's broken, none of that can be seen, let alone acted on, without the light of the rules. Unless the rules help us see that thing is broken. It's not just a bunch of pieces on the ground. It's a broken thing. You cannot see that if you're running away from the rules. You can't see it if you're running away from standards. You can't see it if you're running away from the idea that I'm called to higher things and not lower things. If your basic posture is get off me, get all your weights and standards off me, you cannot even see that there are things in your life that are broken. By definition, you can't see them. The only reason that you can is because God's image is stamped on you, and so you just cannot get away from the rules fully, even though you would try to. We definitely can't see how something could be fixed unless some rule or standard comes in and goes, this is what it would look like for this thing to be fixed. You've got to stop running away from the rules. The faith that you get from God, the grace that he gives you, the mercy that he gives you, helps you get started on the road of being able to say something in my life is broken. But if you want to continue on it, what God is often going to do is he's going to come in and he's going to say, would you take on the law of my son and see how Jesus would have done that thing? Would you see how Jesus would walk on that thing? Would you see how Jesus would continue in that thing? Would you see how he would treat that person? Would you see how he would deal with that disappointment? What would Jesus do? That's what God is going to ask you. He's going to give you the law of what Jesus would do. And unless you say yes to that at some point, unless you foundationally say, I want to take that on, there's nowhere for you to go. And there's no way for these things in your life to get fixed. Being able to accept the rules means that we've got to be willing at some point through the rules to see that we've fallen down. Right? This falling that we do and that we're afraid of. I can never fall down from this great height. I can't have that crack exposed. I can't experience this breaking, whatever it is. We live lives just over and over again trying to protect ourselves from falling. Like, I can't endure a fall. You know, I mean, I'm just living this in real time because I'm the parent of a 1.5-year-old. Just falling and getting back up is just a wonderful, normal part of my son's life and existence. At some point, we feel like I should be done falling. I mean, the reality is that, like, if a person just physically, like, as we age, if we get to a place where, like, we cannot endure a fall, we are in a very fragile, precarious spot, right? I mean, part of, like, what getting older well, like, is physically being able to endure things like that. Like, why then do we, like, as soon as we get into adulthood, we put ourselves on some path where we're like, I could never endure a fall? All that means is that you are fragile. All that means is that you're not strong yet. All that means is that you're terrified. I mean, person after person in our world, it just spends a huge amount of money and, I mean, just everything. All the things that people do to keep themselves from undergoing a fall. All the money, all the non-disclosure stuff, all the handshaking and secret meetings, all the stuff that we do to be like, I just have to keep looking this certain way. Those people are remarkably, remarkably fragile. And they built a version of themselves that, though it looks to the world as a version of themselves that is strong, is shockingly weak. You don't want to be that sort of person. You want to be a person that can fall and bounce and get back up again. And maybe fall and break something, but not be totally broken. To trust that God's going to put me back together again. I want to share a final thought about this. You know, there's an interesting thing that the New Testament says about Jesus' body. I've sort of pushed on the theme in this sermon that Jesus' body was broken. Well, that's true. Jesus' body was broken. But there's a second current running in the scriptures about Jesus' body, and it actually talks about how none of his bones were broken. Right? There's an Old Testament scripture that says none of your bones were broken. And the gospel authors bring that out with respect to the details of Jesus' crucifixion, such that that passage was true. So on the one hand, the scriptures say Jesus' body was broken, and on the other hand, they say that Jesus' bones weren't broken. And I want to just offer that to you today as a suggestion that when we do go through brokenness in our nature and things that do need to break so that God can put them back together in a new way, God is sovereign over what's breaking and what isn't. And in the same way that Jesus' body, in an essential way, his body was broken through what he went through, like the skeleton of himself remained intact. And I want to suggest to you that the things that God needs to break in you when you say yes to the rules so that you can be fixed and put back together, that God knows the things that make you you. God is not out to grind your bones into the dust. God is out to say, here are some things that need to break so I can put them together in a new way. Here are some things from your old self that need to break so I can put them back together. Here are some things from your fleshly nature that need to break so I can rebirth them into a spiritual nature. God is sovereign over those things. So I know it's scary to fall. It's scary to feel like I'm going to take on some standards that might show me how I've fallen. But I want to suggest that you can do even that because you can know that God is trustworthy to show you the right places that are broken, and He's trustworthy not to want to just grind you into the dust. He's not just breaking things for fun. He wants to break the things that in some way are already broken so that they can be put back together in a new and living way. God will fix and can fix anything in your life that you will let Him into. Any way that you will let Him into saying, God, it would be good for you to speak your rules and your judgments over me. It would be good, and I know that you're good and trustworthy to do it because you put Jesus back together so you can put me back together. You have to choose whether or not you're going to let God do this. That's up to you. Nobody can do that but you. Nobody can figure that out in dialogue except the dialogue between you and God. At some point, you have to choose. And there is a current and a challenge in this time to us accepting any rules or standards or judgments at all. You've got to get them from somewhere. You know that there are things that are broken in your life. If you want them to be fixed, you've got to grab rules and standards from somewhere. You should grab them from the living God who's trustworthy with the things that get broken and who can put anything back together again. And that includes you. Amen.